Hello, and welcome to Nightmare Masterclass. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. Tonight I'm joined by a certain fellow YouTuber.
Hey, it's Kay, and this is Skittles, Chief Hydrologist.
In this installment, we'll be unpacking the Lovecraftian cinematic nightmare known as Color Out of Space, starring everybody's favorite loose cannon, Nicolas Cage, as well as Jolie Richardson, Elliot Knight, Madeline Arthur, and, Tommy Chong? Yep, Tommy Chong is in this film. That's how you know it's good. There's something in the water down at the Gardner farm. Color Out of Space is about a family who has just moved to a remote area in New England, and, well, as you might expect, horror ensues. Specifically, the Gardner's farm is hit by a meteorite which contains some kind of unfathomable alien entity. This entity doesn't operate in a way you might expect with your run-of-the-mill horror film. It doesn't track the Gardners down and murder them one by one. Rather, it has a pervasive effect on the environment, transforming everything it comes across in various horrifying ways. The movie is based on a short story of the same name by H.P. Lovecraft. As you might know, Lovecraft was a weird fiction pioneer, and his name has long since become synonymous with a certain kind of horror. Specifically, the term Lovecraftian connotes that which is so incomprehensibly horrific, it drives the protagonist to madness. His place in the pantheon of literary horror aside, I would be remiss not to point out that Lovecraft himself was a virulent racist, not to mention a fascist sympathizer for much of his life. While Color Out of Space, the film, maintains certain tropes associated with Lovecraft's work, it also veers from the story in fairly significant ways. So for the purposes of this video, we're mostly going to be thinking of the film on its own terms. Let's begin with a general point about the primary focus of this movie, that is, the Gardner family. The Gardners, with their 2.5 children, evince the concept of the nuclear family. While familial ties have generally been considered very important all throughout human history, the nuclear family has not always been the norm. The term itself did not emerge until the early 20th century. It can be understood as a historical contingency, a phenomenon that has come about as a result of industrialization. In other words, the nuclear family as a social unit only became viable after a certain stage of economic development. For a time, the nuclear family served an important function in the maintenance and reproduction of capitalism. This was strongly reinforced through ideological means, which one might argue basically amounts to a kind of propaganda. During the nuclear family's height in the 50s, pretty much every depiction of family life in pop culture entailed the nuclear structure. A heterosexual married couple with a few kids. The man's role? Why, provide for his family, of course. And due to the ubiquity of patriarchal norms at the time, women in this arrangement were relegated to child-rearing and other domestic duties. And kids, be sure to go to school and do your homework so you can grow up to do just the same. Simply put, this is the ideology of the nuclear family. Towards the beginning of the film, Color Out of Space establishes a familial dynamic that is quote-unquote traditional in some respects, but striking in other ways. On one hand, the Gardner family consists of a heterosexual married couple with 3 kids. So there's nothing unusual there in terms of the predominant ideology that upholds the nuclear family. On the other hand, Teresa is the primary breadwinner in this family. She's some kind of financial advisor, and her job seems incredibly stressful. It's clear from various details in the film that both Gardner parents are haunted by certain socially ingrained notions of what they're supposed to be. Nathan seems to have purchased a herd of alpacas as part of some kind of small business venture, but really, it kind of seems like the alpacas are just a way to keep him preoccupied. They make him feel useful, like he still has a role to play in providing for his family. And Teresa is perhaps a bit overly protective of their kids in order to compensate for the fact that she has to work so much. Importantly, she works from home, but her office is in the attic, away from the rest of the family. Tellingly, there's a moment very early on in the film when Jack, the gardener's youngest, expresses that he misses his mom's cooking. One gets the sense that the family is adjusting to a relatively new situation. What brought them to this point? In Nathan's words, "A dream you dream alone is just a dream. A dream you dream together is reality." What is this shared reality Nathan wishes to take part in with his loved ones? Nathan's dream is simply for his family to prosper in the refuge of a farm, which they have recently purchased specifically for that purpose: peace, seclusion, simplicity. One gathers the sense that Nathan is attempting to escape the various perils of modern life, the hustle and bustle of urban living, traffic jams, noise and light pollution, crowded grocery stores. It's an understandable impulse to try and get away from it all. And it really was a valiant effort on his part. But if you've seen the film, you of course know that things didn't quite work out for the gardeners. What happened to them? After the meteorite impact, Nathan reassures his youngest by telling him that he's just had a bad dream. Of course, the meteor, or rather, what is contained within the meteor, is more real than anyone in the family is capable of imagining. Nathan's project, his beautiful dream he wished to make into a reality with his family, has been ruptured by some incomprehensible horror, the likes of which have, by the end of the film, rendered the gardener's entire property to ash. Over the course of the movie, the alien's maligned influence begins to eat away at Nathan's dream. Its confounding presence illuminates the underlying fallacy motivating Nathan's entire worldview. As it turns out, you can't bend reality to your will in the way that Nathan desired. Reality is more than just a shared vision, because in reality, there are always unknown variables to deal with. There's always something you haven't accounted for. One might say the film suggests a certain limit, or perhaps even negation of the whole pastoral ideal. Turns out farm life isn't all it's cracked up to be. But I would like to argue that packing up and moving your family to a secluded farm is really just one way you might attempt to escape in our current moment. What the film really demonstrates is that when one is faced with certain worldview-shattering revelations, true escape is impossible. And once your understanding of the world has been revealed for the shallow farce that it is, all manner of psychological reactions abound. How each of the family members cope with the earth-shattering revelation brought on by this alien force. This is the real thematic content of Color Out of Space. Of course, each of these reactions are mediated by various social norms. And that's true even when a given character's reaction is rooted in an oppositional predisposition towards said norms. Let's take, for instance, Ezra, played by Tommy Chong. I didn't quite know what to make of Ezra at first, but upon further reflection, I actually think he serves a pretty important function in the movie, specifically with respect to the film's overarching themes. Ezra represents a complete and total shirking of convention. He doesn't have a family. Aside from a sparse number of interactions with the gardeners, he lives a solitary life, which he seems entirely content with. And importantly, Ezra is totally off the grid. There's a certain romanticism to this kind of lifestyle. It's alluring, especially when you consider the myriad demands placed upon the working class in late capitalism, not to mention the hellish confines of the nuclear family. Because of Ezra's unconventional perspective, he's able to identify that something is terribly wrong prior to the other characters. He's even able to ascertain the entity's ability to warp time itself. To be sure, Ezra falls victim to the entity just like the gardeners, and this, I would argue, is thematically significant. Despite his valiant effort to warn people about the impending danger of this alien force, Ezra's rugged individualism couldn't save him. There's no off the grid in 2020. In fact, the entire concept has become a shallow marketing gimmick used to sell survival gear and tiny homes. And when an unknowable, transformative force comes about, no one, no matter how much of a free-thinking individual they might be, is really immune to its all-encompassing effects. Now, I felt that Benny, the gardener's oldest, was a bit underdeveloped as far as his character was concerned. Though with what little there is to work with, it is nonetheless clear that Benny's withdrawn nature is a symptom of some underlying dysfunction within the Gardner household. Namely, I'd say they're a bit repressed. This is represented in the film by persistent connection and communication problems. After Teresa's little accident, Nathan isn't able to get through on the phone to give the kids an update on her condition. And all throughout the movie, the gardener's spotty internet connection is a point of frustration for Teresa, who of course needs it to do her job. At the level of the text, we can attribute this to the entity's disruptive nature. But the manner in which this alien force disrupts everyday life and even changes the behavior of certain characters can be understood as a metaphorical analog for all of the various problems entailed by this familial dysfunction. On that note, it strikes me as important that Teresa becomes attached to her youngest in some kind of horrific fusing process. Why does the trajectory of her character arc result in this particular fate? Well, prior to this melding, Teresa's accident establishes her as a woman who has gradually been pushed beyond the point of stability. It is no coincidence that this occurs during a domestic routine. Namely, she's cooking dinner for her family. One gets the sense that this is something she used to do quite a bit, but not so much as of late. During a series of rote movements, chopping carrots, Teresa accidentally cuts off a couple fingers. Note that even after she cuts off her fingers, Teresa continues chopping. So the continuation of an outmoded domestic routine results in the loss of certain appendages. It would suffice to say that I think this is symbolically important, especially when you consider what happens to her later on. In a certain sense, Teresa is being pushed and pulled in opposing directions. On one hand, there's a societal expectation imposed on her to take care of her family, particularly with respect to domestic obligations. And then, of course, there are the myriad demands of her high-stress job, which increasingly seem to prevent her from caring for her family in this way. The result is that when Teresa is present, she tends to compensate by being a bit overprotective. This ironically drives her older children away. As is common during adolescence, they're trying to establish themselves as separate entities from their parents. But our youngest, Jack, is still a little kid. He is the only person who is truly receptive to his mother's overbearing presence, hence the fusing. In a way, this alien force is really only manifesting or perhaps laying bare a psychological problem that already existed prior to its arrival. As for Nathan, well, I don't think it's contentious to say that men are socially conditioned such that we're more prone to express our frustration via outward hostility and anger. As such, it makes sense that Nathan experiences horrific bouts of mania throughout the film. A cinematic treat for you Nicolas Cage appreciators out there. I see you. The effect of this is all the more troublesome considering the movie establishes Nathan as basically a decent guy. He is very decidedly not quick to anger. So when Nathan begins to stray from this behavioral pattern, it's conspicuous. Over the course of the film, we learn that Nathan very much defines himself in opposition to his father. One gets the sense that as the rails begin to come off, Nathan exhibits more and more of his father's characteristics, namely alcoholism and rage. Not a fun combo. It is heavily implied that Teresa has had her breast removed due to cancer. Towards the beginning of the film, she expresses insecurity about her body, and Nathan makes efforts to reassure her. Yet after the mania takes hold, he makes comments that seem to evince a certain resentment on his part vis-a-vis her harrowing bout with cancer. Has this incomprehensible alien entity colonized his mind, causing him to react in a maligned way? Or rather, perhaps more interestingly, has the world-upending revelation of the alien's existence driven Nathan to a breaking point, causing him to reveal, in a very insensitive fashion, certain resentments which he had in reality harbored all along? Maybe he wanted his life to go a different way. Maybe at this point, he feels imprisoned by his own family. The very same question lingers when Nathan freaks out at his kids. And the real horror is, there's no way of knowing the answer. I really have to point out that the entire movie can be understood as a kind of perverse fantasy wish fulfillment for Lavinia, the gardener's daughter. She casts a spell towards the beginning of the film indicating her desire to escape this familial arrangement. Of course, at this point in the movie, it would be entirely reasonable to assume she's just going through some rebellious phase, but consciously or otherwise, it does seem as though she's identified certain problems with her family. The film leaves it open as to whether Lavinia truly does escape to some otherworldly realm, or if she simply gets obliterated with the rest of her family. What is clear, however, is that she deeply regrets taking the love of her family for granted.
There's something uniquely frightening about a force we can't fully perceive, let alone understand, seeping into our lives and changing us. Not just as individuals, but socially, creating new stresses and dangers that fundamentally alter the way we interact with each other. Thank God none of us know what that's like, right? But more frightening than an unseen destructive force is one that infects us by way of the mundane, the routine. There's a special kind of violation that comes from the danger getting to you through something you associate with safety or something you take for granted. There's a reason so much horror revolves around people being attacked in their own homes, often in their own beds. The gardeners experience a similar violation. They are exposed to the color through their tap water. How much attention do you pay to the water at home? If you started feeling strange one day, would one of your first assumptions be there's something in the water? Or would that be one of the last things you consider? After all, you drink it, bathe in it, touch it every day. There's never a problem. You probably think about your tap water about as much as you think about taking the bus, going to work, to the pub, touching the table, shaking someone's hand, touching a glass that someone in the kitchen touched, touching a doorknob that God knows how many people have touched. But you think about it now, don't you? Ever since The Thing. And it feels wrong. It feels like a previous way of life has been pulled out from under us. There's this constant background noise of stress and uncertainty, and we're the lucky ones. At time of recording, 1 million people have died because of The Thing. 1 million. That's a big number. So big that it doesn't really mean that much, does it? Would it feel any different if I'd said 2 million? I mean, that's twice as many dead human beings, but it feels about the same, right? There's a reason for that. Dunbar's number is a theory put forward by anthropologist Robin Dunbar that there is a cognitive limit to the number of people we can maintain stable social relationships with, where we can know and recognize every member of the group as well as their relationships to everyone else in the group. In other words, Dunbar's number measures the maximum amount of people that we can really perceive as fully fleshed out people. That number is about 150. In greater numbers, people become abstract, hypothetical. Logically, we know they're all still people, but we don't fully perceive it. We can't. Dunbar's number indicates a truth behind the often misattributed quote, "One death is a tragedy, 1 million deaths is a statistic." Anyone who has lost someone close to them knows intimately what it feels like. Imagine that grief, that loss multiplied by 1 million. You can't, and you should be relieved that you can't, because you probably could not survive that level of distress. At the very least, your psyche would never be the same again. That's part of what's given Lovecraft's work such a lasting influence. It invites us to wonder what would happen if we looked at the unseeable, if we tried to comprehend the incomprehensible. How could ideas like that not resonate with us, especially today? Every tragedy, every atrocity, every thing can be broadcasted into our homes 24 hours a day. We can stay up to date on all the body counts and keep the horror at the forefront of our minds. But for many of us, we're used to that horror happening to someone else. We're used to being separate from it all, out on a metaphorical farmhouse, far from the noise and the danger. It's different when you know the thing could be all around you, anytime, anywhere. At the end of the film, the local government builds a dam and floods the entire valley where the gardeners lived. They literally cover the whole thing up, and they cover it with water. The vehicle the color used to spread to its victims. Could we be so desperate not to acknowledge the genuinely incomprehensible scale of something, so quick to put it out of sight, that we risk reproducing the threat and putting ourselves in even greater danger?
The alien entity in Color Out of Space spreads like a virus, affecting everything it comes across. Time itself warps in proximity to the thing. The key metaphor here is that our prevailing mode of production does just the same thing. Capital transforms the world in its image. It even changes our understanding of time via the workday, and it mediates our societal response to certain catastrophic events. Specifically, it gives primacy to the unrelenting drive for profit, even when it means people will die in that pursuit. Lovecraft tends to relegate the literary trope of incomprehensible horror to an externality, in this case, a meteorite, the source of which is wholly unknown. But the unfortunate truth is that most of the horrors we experience on a daily basis come about as a result of our man-made system. The call is coming from inside the house. That wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare Masterclass. If you enjoy my videos and want to support me on a monthly basis, you can do so at patreon.com/Nightmare Masterclass. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to Kay and Skittles on YouTube. In particular, I think you might be interested in Kay's Midsummer analysis, so check it out. Thank you for watching, and good night.